So I've got a status bar. Well, hello, folks. Welcome and thank you for joining us here today. We are just kind of getting going with a little bit of a rough start tonight, at least technologically, and that's more my fault than anything. My name is Jeff Gallagher, and I'm one of the pastors here at Trinity Baptist, and I want to welcome anyone who's joining in either here tonight on Tuesday, January the 12th, or if you are maybe joining us a little bit later on in the week, depending upon what your schedule is like. Today, we are going to have just a 1 week special on the topic of mental health. But before we get any further into this, you've noticed that there are some much better looking people who are on the screen here as well. And these are some folks from Trinity who are going to be some special guests here tonight. And so I'm going to let the two of you introduce yourselves as well. Why don't you go ahead?
Hi, everyone. It's really nice to be here tonight sharing with you. My name's Dr. Barbara Sinn, and I'm a family physician. I work here in Sherwood Park.
Yes, hello, and I'm Dr. Ralph Sinn, and I'm a general practitioner, and my practice of medicine is to provide psychotherapy.
Excellent. Thanks so much for joining us. You guys are, of course, people that if others go to Trinity, you are familiar faces, but you do have this professional background that I think very uniquely positions you to really be helpful for our conversation on mental health tonight. Now, what I should say right off the bat is if any of you have any particular comments or questions that arise as we talk here tonight, by all means, you can type something in the comments section of Facebook, or you can send me an email, and we will follow up on that. We're really not going to do live Q&A here on the fly today, but if there's enough questions, we might actually end up doing a Q&A session for next week. So more on that a little bit later, but maybe let me start off by just kind of talking about why I think it might be helpful for us to talk about mental health now. Thankfully, this isn't so much of a taboo subject like it may have been years ago, but why now and why not at the beginning of the pandemic? Why don't I explain a little bit, and I'll turn it over to Ralph and to Barbara as well to talk about some conditions they've seen at the ground level. So maybe I'll start by saying, hey, we're going into the 11th month of this pandemic. That's had some wear and tear on all of us, mentally and emotionally, for sure. And I would say even too, this is the time of year that's quite often very difficult for people. It's very dark for a lot of the day and the evening, not a lot of sunlight. It's often really cold. It isn't yet, but it will be. And we don't even have Christmas to look forward to anymore. For many of us, Christmas has been packed up and put away and shoved under, the stairs again. So now we're just kind of stuck with old man winter. But besides those general conditions, of course, we have this COVID pandemic and all the things that go along with that. And I think there's just general anxiety. You don't have to look very far around the world and evening news to see things that are pretty troubling right now. And maybe just, again, very personally, and this is anecdotally on my perspective, there's just a good number of folks that are needing some pastoral care right now. All of us will have times in our lives when we need care, but there just seems to be more of that more often right now, at least that I'm seeing, and our staff are seeing at the church. But maybe enough of me talking about that. Why don't I turn it over to the two of you? What have you been seeing at the ground level? Ralph, I think you wanted to introduce with a little something first.
Sure, yes. I think when we're talking about mental health, I find it convenient to divide how we approach it from comparing who we are as humans with a computer, and with the specific focus that a computer has a hardware component and it has a software component. And from a hardware point of view, we're looking at like brain structure and function. Might be similar to what are the rules of hockey, the size of the rink, the size of pads, things like that. The type of your equipment. From a software point of view, we're looking at how we're working with the tools and the creativity that we have when we're playing we're playing the game. So Barbara's going to be dealing with things mostly from a hardware point of view, although there's going to be some overlap because that's the complexity of being human is like. But she'll be dealing mostly with the hardware aspect, and I'll be dealing mostly with the software aspect.
Good. So, yeah, so from a ground level, I think what I've observed at my clinic and with some of my patients is that many people find themselves to be very overwhelmed with the complexity of the pandemic. So there's changing guidelines, they're questioning what applies to me. And now we have the additional concerns and worries and wonderings about the vaccine. There's been, certain orders. So that's all very complex. And people are wondering about all of that and finding it overwhelming. And that is particularly bad for people who already have underlying mental health issues. They find it even more challenging. I think another thing people are experiencing at the ground level is a real fear for the health of their loved ones, and particularly fear for seniors that they're close to, and also fear for people in sort of the age group of the older teens and the young adults who maybe tend to involve in more high-risk activities by definition of their age and stage in life, which leads to more concerns with regards to the pandemic as well. Sadly, we've also seen an increase in domestic violence, and that's pervasive through all of society. It's in the church, it's in the communities, it's everywhere, and that has also increased. The other thing that's increased is substance use. And of course, substance use and mental health issues always will go hand in hand. So that's something else that's really obvious at the ground level. Ralph.
Right, thank you, Barbara. And from a software point of view, I'll be thinking mostly about the isolation aspect. And just from a software point of view, what I do in terms of psychotherapy is I'm assessing what I call our mindset, whether it's constructive or destructive. And one way of thinking about that is, what are we attributing our emotions to? And in a destructive framework, we're either blaming ourselves or blaming someone else for how we feel. It's basically an external cause. We're putting an external cause into our emotions, making it either like a person or a situation, like the pandemic. In a constructive way, we're actually acknowledging how we feel in the context of the situation, where we're seeing our emotions, our feelings more as a sensory organ to our read of what are the stressors that are part of our lives at the time. So moving on from that, when we're thinking about isolation, I think it's helpful to remind ourselves that as humans, we're social creatures. And in that way, we're made in the image of God. And I think it's a good way to understand the Trinity, because the Trinity is three persons in one. So there's a relationship. And so we're relational creatures. In that way, we're in his image. I find that something to be aware of from that point of view is it appears that extroverts are more affected severely than introverts, and it may be because they're relying on an external positive experience. If they're going through this stress in a destructive mindset, so they're relying on something external to help them feel better. Alpha people might be more susceptible or affected more severely because they might be relying on social influence to have meaning. And from a love language point of view, it may be that someone whose love language is more on the side of physical touch or your huggers, you might be affected more severely because we have to have that social distance. And when I'm pointing out some of these ways that people are, I'm not saying it's better to be an introvert versus an extrovert, or there's something wrong with your love language, or if you're an alpha person. These are just differences of normal for a person. But if you're kind of in that category, just be aware that you'll have to pay more attention to your mental health with the stress that we're having in this pandemic.
I was nodding my head so much as you guys were talking. I think that each of you, obviously with that hardware and software analogy that you're using, there's different experiences that you have in your line of work, but I think those are excellent observations. I was nodding my head thinking about things either to do with myself or people I've been in contact with who have been experiencing these kinds of things during the pandemic. Maybe I'll interject here just a little bit. What I'd like to do, just from a pastoral or a biblical perspective, is just make sure that we're okay talking about mental health. I would guess that if people are watching online and they've tracked with us so far, they've probably picked up on the fact that we're Christians, where this is a video coming out of a church. But I do think that Christians sometimes really shoot ourselves in the foot when it comes to talking about mental health because we over spiritualize things. Whether talking about the joy of the Lord and just thinking that, if we just maybe are spiritual enough and walking with the Spirit close enough, that we'll never have bad days, we'll never be depressed or things like that. And that's, I think we've got to quite honestly say that's really very silly. I think most people would probably agree with that in principle, but when they're going through a tough time, there is that guilty feeling that I must have something wrong with me spiritually. So we have to give ourselves the permission to be broken people in more ways than one. And maybe one other thing that I'd say is that, God wants us to be redeemed and to be whole, completely whole, as whole people. The way that we often divvy up our personhood between a physical aspect and spiritual and emotional, psychological, social, all these different things. That's helpful to a degree. To a degree, though, that's our language doing a something. My analogy that I would have for that would be to think of a nice, hot, warm, runny cherry pie. And, we can put whatever slices we want on the crust on the top. But let's be honest, all that nice, awesome, tasty gooiness just kind of flows quite organically underneath. And so it is with us as people. We don't fit into neatly divided categories. And if we're unhealthy in one area, it will understandably bleed into another. And so we wouldn't want to just cordon off this particular area and say, nah, we don't need to deal with it. We can just pursue health in some of the others. God wants us to have that whole wholeness to us that only He can bring in a whole host of ways. And that isn't just done in your prayer closet. That can be done by physically taking care of your body and by pursuing mental health in some of the ways we'll talk about today. But I'm probably going to be preaching to the choir if I go any longer here. So why don't I turn it back over to you? We want to zero in on anxiety and depression. There are, of course, a whole host of mental health issues and conditions that are out there. But we want to focus on these two because they're very common and they're probably some of the best well known, at least at a street level. But we have two doctors here with us. Why don't we let you give us some good, accurate definitions of anxiety and depression?
Thanks, Jeff. That's excellent. It's so healthy and good for us to be talking about mental health and to acknowledge it as a medical condition. It's a real medical problem that exists just like diabetes or heart disease. It's nothing to be ashamed of. And so let's talk about it a little bit more. And you're right, depression and anxiety are oh so common. You talked about definitions, and I guess as physicians, we kind of look more at diagnostic criteria, but it's the same idea. So when we look at depression, and by the way, depression and anxiety often overlap. So you can experience either one, and you might experience one for a while and then another. They often overlap. But when we're looking at depression, a definition is to be feeling down or depressed. Seems obvious, but it's not always so obvious. And by down, that means sad, empty, hopeless. Those are all kind of some terms people will often use. There's also definitely at times a real loss of interest or pleasure. And people might not always identify that, but something that used to give you a lot of pleasure that you're looking forward to, all of a sudden it has no meaning to you. That's a real loss of interest or pleasure and could be one of your symptoms of depression or a definition there. Another really common symptom or definition is sleep disturbances. So whether that's insomnia, not being able to sleep, or what we call hypersomnia, sleeping too much, that can also be a real definite symptom or definition. There's others, those are probably the most common. Keep in mind too that with depression and anxiety, when it comes to looking at it from a hardware perspective, we know there are definite chemicals in your brain that we call neurochemicals that are altered in depression and anxiety. So that's where we really can relate to it being a definite medical condition. So when it comes to anxiety, most commonly people will feel an excessive, uncontrollable amount of worry and fear. Worry is probably the really big one, excessive and uncontrollable. Someone who's feeling anxious will be easily annoyed or irritable. So relationship difficulties often crop up in that situation. A lot of times physical symptoms become exaggerated, more prominent. Digestive symptoms, fatigue, muscle tension, headache, those are all some physical symptoms that will come out with anxiety. And then when it comes to these symptoms or definitions we're looking at, in order to really hone in on the diagnosis, those characteristics need to be pervasive. So they're really involving every part of your life, at home, at work, socially, nearly every day, and for a period of at least 2 weeks, often longer. I've heard people say, all I could think about was how bad I feel. And I think that's a pretty realistic way of describing a person who's depressed or anxious when it's actually a clinical diagnosis. And then Ralph, what would you have to share about that for?
Thank you, Barbara. So to talk about the software side of things, I think I just want to expand a little bit the idea of the software here, and that is how we're working, we're making sense, how we're using our thoughts, our behaviors, our emotions, and in the context of the relationships we have. And that would include a relationship with ourselves, a relationship with others, and from a Christian point of view, our relationship with Jesus. When we're in what I call the destructive mindset, the way we relate with the world tends to be in the setting of power. So we're all either going to try to feel powerful, or we're going to feel powerless or helpless in the face of what we're dealing with. And in contrast, the constructive mindset is more about relating our emotions with the truth of the situation that's going on. And I find a very powerful biblical example of the difference between a constructive and a destructive mindset is the scene between Jesus and Pilate at his trial. To me, Jesus is a person who's totally constructive. And none of us, the way we are right now, are that way. We can work on being more constructive, but we're going to have a mix of constructive and destructive mindset. And for our purpose, we're hoping to be as constructive as we can. But Jesus is totally constructive, and Pilate represents the most powerful people in the world at the time. And Pilate is telling Jesus something like, don't you know that I have the power to set you free or put you to death? Like, don't you know that? And how does Jesus respond? He says, I know, you're right. What am I gonna do? That's not the version that I've seen. Jesus says, you would not have any power over you unless it was given to you by my Father. And that's truth. Mm-hmm. So it actually says that Pilate was trying to set him free after that, but he was overwhelmed by power. Also, as Christians, we do have the whole access to the Holy Spirit to guide us in terms of understanding truth. He's the wonderful counselor. He's our guide that indwells us. And so there's so much value in being a Christian, in navigating through these stresses, that doesn't take the stress away, but it helps us to give us a guide to navigate through the stress and guide us into a constructive way to do that, as far as I'm concerned. So when it comes to depression, generally I would look at depression as a destructive mindset against the self, generally for past issues. And we're going to have a sense of powerlessness, helplessness, and hopelessness that goes along with that. Or we're going to have a sense of powerless, destructive mindset with others or an external situation where we may feel oppressed and then helpless and hopeless. When it comes to anxiety, generally I see that as a destructive mindset associated with a lack of control or powerlessness in the face of a big, powerful circumstance like the pandemic or fear of the future. So those aspects seem to be more consistent with depression and anxiety from a software point of view.
One of the things that I really appreciate about what we're doing here today is that this is being recorded. And so we can go back and take bite-sized chunks of what you have shared with us, because I think there's just a lot there. And in fact, I think you have already started to answer the next question that I was going to ask the both of you. Each one of you gave some red flags, or at least some indicators of what a person might be experiencing if they are suffering anxiety or depression. But I thought maybe I'd just kind of ask it overtly. Is there anything else that you would like to add? Some red flags that would indicate, and here I think this is a place for us to kind of shine the mirror up, so to speak, or hold the mirror up to ourselves, and let the two of you, maybe to use Ralph's words, speak some truth about hardware or software realities that might kind of make us think, whoa, actually, I shouldn't blow this off. There might be something here that I need to check out further. So what would be some red flags that you haven't mentioned yet?
Yeah, so I think probably when it comes to depression and anxiety, red flags, they definitely overlap. So I'm just going to talk about the red flags in general for depression and or anxiety. So obviously feeling down, we talked about that. Often that sense of feeling down can lead to recurrent thoughts of death. And that's what you really want to watch for. If you're starting to think about death or dying, like I'd rather not be here, people would be better off without me, why can't I just fall asleep and never wake up? Those kinds of thoughts can often lead to suicidal thoughts or plans. Those are real. That is a real big red flag. If you have any thoughts like that, beware. We're going to talk about some ideas for what you can do, but watch for that. An increase in substance use. I talked about that earlier. And certainly a lot of people will use substances to self-medicate, to escape, or to feel better. If you're starting to drink more alcohol, starting to use other substances for that reason, then be cautious, take care, look out. An increase in physical symptoms. I talked a little bit about that, especially if these physical symptoms are starting to really overwhelm you, impair your function. So headache, back pain, digestive symptoms, fatigue is a really big one. If you're really noticing that, those can be red flags. And then self-isolation. Obviously, if you start saying, I don't want to do anything, I'm just staying home. I mean, we're all isolating already, but if you're isolating even more, like no phone calls, those kinds of things, watch out for that. When you're doing that, and you can identify that. So those are some red flags that I think are really important to be aware of. Ralph?
Thank you, Barbara. From a software point of view, I think red flags would be looked at with consistent with what I call the destructive mindset. So self-blame, if we're wrapped in a lot of self-blame, we might be feeling frozen or helpless. We might be feeling guilty. If we're blaming others, we might be more on the irritable side. We might lash out, might even be violent. If we have a sense of powerlessness, we could have a tendency to rely on an external source to work on that. It could be alcohol or other substance for stress relief. So that might be a red flag as well.
Excellent. So as you guys have listed these things, either now or a little earlier on, again, people might, if they're watching this today, if they're watching this video days or weeks after we produce this, and they're thinking to themselves, oh boy, someone's reading my mail here. You know, if they've realized that they've got a lot of these red flags, what should they do next? We live in Sherwood Park, so some of our answers here might use certain place names perhaps that are local to the area, and that's okay. But practically speaking, what would be some of your suggestions of things that people should do?
Yeah, so from a hardware perspective or from a real practical perspective, the first thing to do is to seek help. Looking for help, asking for help is a sign of strength. So tell someone that cares about you, that that you're struggling and that you're struggling with mental health. Seek out your family doctor. Family doctors have a lot of expertise in the area of mental health, and we can really help you to navigate the resources. There are a lot of resources out in our communities, and a lot of them are very specific and very tailored to certain situations. And your family doctor can help you navigate those. We also use the primary care network here in Sherwood Park, at least I do quite a bit. And they keep up with all of the resources available. I can't keep up with them all. Ralph can't keep up with them all, but that's their job. So we can direct you there to help you with that. Your family doctor might also consider whether or not a medication might be indicated for you. We have some very effective medications to help with mental health. I mentioned before about the chemicals in your brain. These medications modify those chemicals. And I've had patients who've resisted trying medications. They come to the point where they feel like it's the right time and we get going on something and they say, Dr. Sinn, thank you so much. I wish I'd started this a long time ago. I feel so much better.
Wow.
So just consider that, please. The other thing too is I just want to mention there's a facility now called Access 24/7, which basically is located in a place near the Royal Alec Hospital, Anderson Hall. But it's called 24/7 because you can access them for any mental health issues, any addiction issues. And if all you Google is AHS, Alberta Health Services, 24/7, you'll find it. I think another really healthy thing to help yourself in the pandemic, and I've seen this suggested in a couple of Zoom talks that I saw that were offered by psychiatrists, and that is to really ground yourself in healthy routines. When we're home a lot, working from home, sometimes a lot of the routines kind of go by the wayside. But having a healthy routine day to day is going to help with mental health for sure. As a believer, it's important, very important, to be grounded in prayer and Bible reading every day. I've heard some of the psychiatrists talked about other ways to be grounded, but I thought theirs were kind of fluffy, and I like the idea of really being grounded in prayer and Bible study. And then eat your 3 meals a day, exercise regularly, even if it's a 30-minute walk you're going to do every day. And then have special time carved out for when you work, when you do chores, when you have recreation. And if you find yourself starting to get bogged down, then mix it up a bit. You're home, you can set your own schedule, but it's healthy to have those routines. Some of us are really good at routines and others of us aren't, but routines are healthy. And then I think lastly, through the pandemic, I think many of us are feeling lonely. And I know Ralph's described loneliness before as spiritual hunger, and not so much spiritual from a religious perspective or our Christian life, but just spiritual in that we want to relate to other human spirits, and we're lonely and we're missing that. So with spiritual hunger, you need to feed yourself. Just like with physical hunger, you feed yourself, nobody feeds you. So take that initiative to reach out. It's hard when you're feeling lonely and you think, why doesn't someone call me? But you need to feed yourself. So make a list of 7 to 10 people that you know well, that you can call up. And even if you call one a day, by 7 to 10 days, you've got through your list and you can start over again. You're not going to be bugging anybody. So I think those are some practical things that you can do to help yourself. But please do seek help. Don't sit at home and suffer and get yourself worse off.
Excellent.
Ralph.
Thank you, Barbara. Okay, just want to say from a software point of view, it's also a real practical point of view as well.
Yeah, that's true.
I want to look at self-help There's online resources, there's apps. You'll find that you can have access to, most of which are CBT, and CBT stands for cognitive behavioral therapy. So the focus is on your thoughts, whether they're, what the positive versus negative aspect of it, and your behaviors from a positive or negative point of view. So there's CBT resources, and there's also mindfulness meditation resources. And that is more about working on calmness, which would be kind of thinking about like a way to put on sunglasses when it's too bright out. And so if our emotions are really intense, then you might want to put on, sunglasses, working on calmness to do that. But just to say that it has value, but it has limited value. It can work in the short term, but we're also looking for longer term benefits. It is, mindfulness meditation like that is healthier than alcohol for stress. But also, consider from a Christian point of view, Bible reading and prayer. So there's also self-help books available that you might check the ideas there. And once again, most of them are going to be CBT or mindfulness meditation based, which will be a different approach than what I've been talking about, constructive versus destructive. There's also professional resources like getting in touch with a psychologist or social worker or other psychotherapist. You can access those resources through your family doctor or through the PCN or primary care network, like Barbara mentioned as well. Or you could seek it out directly from your own research or advertisements or word of mouth. And part of that is a healthy relationship or a supportive relationship with your psychotherapist speaks almost louder, they find, than the actual method of psychotherapy. So it's got to be a good fit for you if you're going to be considering professional psychotherapy.
Well, thank you. I think we've covered a lot of ground here tonight for sure. Obviously, we've talked about what we've seen on the ground. You two have both given some really good definitions of anxiety and depression, and both, as we've been saying repeatedly, from a hardware perspective or physiological, generally speaking, and then also from a software perspective. So thank you for that. And of course, we've talked through some different indicators or red flags, and even practically what people can do next. I think maybe I'll wrap it up here by just thanking you, and I'll thank you again here in a moment too, but also just an appeal to everyone that when it comes to our mental health, again, this is a God-given thing for us to steward with his help. We can't just tough this pandemic out. It's been going on too long for, I think, just about I'm a pretty tough cookie myself, and mental health is something I've had to take care of myself as well. So this is just a thing for us all to take good attention to, again, because God desires that we would all be pursuing health in all areas of our life, because he's given us all these areas for good life. So as a reminder to anyone who's been tuning in here tonight, if you really liked what you've heard today, if you want to make any comments, you can like or comment on things here on our Facebook stream today. That'd be wonderful. If you have questions, you can leave them there. If you'd prefer to ask the questions a little more privately, track down my email address here at Trinity Baptist Church here in Sherwood Park and send them my way. If we just receive a few questions, we will probably just follow up privately with you. But if we have a number of questions, we'll always keep those anonymous if we do this, but we have a number of them. We might even come back next week for a little Q&A session with Ralph and Barbara as well. So stay tuned. We'll let you know what we end up doing, whether we do a Q&A session with Ralph and Barbara, or whether we get into the book of 1 Peter, which is where we'll be going sometime very soon here with our Tuesday night Bible studies. But until then, thank you everyone for tuning in, and it's been a privilege again to have you, Ralph and Barbara. You two are friends and your beloved brothers and sisters in Christ for many of us here in the church family, and just thank you for sharing your education and your vocation that you do throughout the week and the fruits of that with us here today. We've benefited from it. So thanks so much.
You're welcome.
You're welcome. It's been a pleasure.
All right. So at this point, we'll stop the live stream. And again, thanks for tuning in, and we'll catch you next time.
Bye-bye.
Bye.